I am really excited about this conversation and to have Lenora Chu with us. She is an American journalist with family roots in China and returned to live in China and ultimately enrolled her son in one of the most elite primary schools in the city. And in her new book, which has just recently come out, Little Soldiers, she shares her experience with her son as a window into China's education system and then extends her study of the system through other personal relationships that give her a window into the experience of older students in Shanghai, of students in less prestigious schools, and of students of the kids of migrant workers in rural communities like those in which Teach for China works. I found this book really captivating. First of all, you all, it's just a really fun and easy read. And secondly, I think holds real potential insights for our work to reimagine education. I've shared briefly with Lenora that we put at the center of our work across Teach for All the imperative of kind of reimagining education so that the students in our classrooms are actually growing as leaders who have the competencies and mindsets and dispositions and agency and such to actually navigate a turbulent economy and solve these increasingly complex problems. And so we're grappling a lot with the questions around, what outcomes should we be aiming at and how should we work towards this broader set of outcomes. And so that was the perspective that I read the book from. And again, I just found that it holds I think it poses some really challenging questions for us and could have real implications for our own work. So let's dive in. I'm going to ask a few questions, as many as I can in the first half hour, and then we'll open it up for the questions of folks across the network. So let's start by actually talking a bit about the experience of your son Rainey in primary school. And again, you guys, as you know, Lenora, we work in the most under-resourced communities, and this is one of the most elite schools in China. But I think it's still interesting because it kind of embodies what China would hope for all of its kids. And so from the perspective of reimagining education, I think it's just could give us interesting insights. So just to dive us in, one of the things, Lenora, that you write about is about how the system breeds conformity and obedience and discipline and hard work. And I'd love for you to share a bit more about how it does this. You share a particular story about eggs, which I cannot get out of my head. Maybe sharing that will help.
Sure. Well, so my husband and I moved to Shanghai in 2010. And if you're in education circles, that's an important year because Shanghai sort of catapulted onto the scene when its teenagers sort of took #1 in the world on a test called PISA in math, reading, and science. Well, just down the street was, as you said, one of the best public schools in the city. We jumped through a number of hoops to get in, and we're thrilled he gets a spot. So immediately our medal is put to the test. The first week of school, his teacher's name is Teacher Chen. And in the book, she doesn't smile, and I find her a very intimidating figure. And when I see her teeth, it's usually a grimace, and the grimace is for me. But she forces my son to eat eggs. And I find out that she's lined up all the children in the classroom and spooned eggs into their mouth until they swallow. Of course, I'm mortified. I run off to school and I say, in America, we don't use methods of force. We incent our children to choose. And she asks, does it work? And I have to admit, not always. And later she scolds me for challenging her authority in front of a child. So, in China, teacher knows best. And this sort of clash of cultures becomes a narrative in which to examine some of these issues.
And so there were aspects of the system that concerned you, and then other aspects that you came to really value. And I wonder if you can just share a bit more about kind of, what the experience was like.
Sure. So I try to, with some of these concerns, the Chinese culture also values group over the individual. When I started asking around, my son had asthma, for example, and I got into all kinds of discussions about where to keep the asthma inhaler. And it's really, no, we can't. It's a distraction for the group. Individual needs are definitely put on a lower rung on the ladder. And then I start getting into other classrooms, and we talk about Little Pumpkin. Little Pumpkin is a boy at the age of 3 that I meet in a more traditional classroom, I would say. And during this first week, he's a very large and lively boy. And the teachers have pretty much singled him out and decided that he is to sit still all day long, to conform to their expectations, and sometimes use yelling and physical force to plant him in his chair. So clearly, I'm a concerned parent. I began looking into some of the reforms that China is undertaking, and indeed, one of them is about, emphasizing the individual child, allowing play, encouraging happy emotions. And so, I have a lot of hope for where China is going, but clearly, there are some problems that they need to fix.
I want to come back to a lot of that actually, but I was struck by how ingrained the value of hard and diligent work is, and how important that becomes to the essentially extraordinary success of at least parts of the Chinese system. And yet it did come through that there are perhaps, I mean, I'd love your perspective on this, but trade-offs between fostering this really, really hard work and discipline on the part of kids, while also fostering creativity and individuality and kind of deep critical thinking skills. How did you come to think about that?
So, there's a term in Chinese culture that, 吃苦, which means eating bitter. And I've really seen that belief in hard work in the classroom can pay off. If you ask Chinese teachers about smarts or intelligence, they don't really go there. They really look at their kids as every child can learn, and they can learn difficult subjects with enough dedicated effort. And if you think about it in sort of Western culture, we label that grit. And the Chinese language around education and all the signaling is about every kid can get this. And when you look at some of the studies, it shows that in Western culture, we're more likely to emphasize talent or innate ability when it comes to learning difficult subjects. And it means we're actually giving up on some kids before they reach their full potential, because we don't believe they have the genetics to learn these, difficult subjects such as math and science. And that to me is one of the biggest learnings from the Chinese value around education.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, in the later years, just as well as I, that it's an exam-based system. Education in China is a sorting mechanism where children drop off and fail to advance into the next level at pretty much every turn, the high school entrance exam, the college entrance exam, and even earlier in rural areas. And that's when, you start to see that becoming a detrimental effect to children's individual expression and their own agency.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, I mean, this came through in reading the book, but maybe just for our group here, it would be helpful. I mean, when you think about what the system did to foster this ethic of really hard work and discipline, can you bring that to life a bit, like what the kind of experience of Rainey was, or what you saw?
Yeah, so very early on, when he was 4, they were sending him counting exercises. And as a mother, I was a bit horrified. I was worried he wasn't going to get it. And by the age of 5, it was triple digits, 107, then 108, 109. And he wasn't getting it. And the teacher scrawled across the top, needs to work harder. And then she would send messages home, you need to get on this and get your child up to speed. I write several passages in the book about this WeChat group, but there's a lot of communications between teacher and parent, sometimes in front of the group about your child's progress. But they're really, especially at this particular school, really on top of making sure you understand where your kid is and where he needs to progress. And oftentimes, there was a progress chart posted in public for everyone to see. Again, as a Western parent, I was mortified. I was worried about how my son would feel in relation to the group. But because of this connection between hard work and achievement, the language is different. The parents are more, okay, let's look at this chart as a measure of progress, and we understand where a child needs to be. And they saw it more as a helpful measure rather than something that could be detrimental to self-esteem. So.
And when you say that as kids progress, there's a kind of trade-off between, like the fostering the hard work and fostering a sense of agency and creativity and individuality. Is that just because of the exam? Do you think, like, the fact that that's the single measure, or do you think is there more to, like, what's sort of at work in that trade-off?
I really think there is I would call it top down. You could call it authoritarian culture in the classroom of teacher knows best, especially the more traditional teachers who have come through the system themselves. There is an element to the culture where if you speak out against a teacher or offer an idea that's contrary to what's expected, the teacher sometimes takes that as an affront to her authority. And that can definitely, I've seen it sort of crush a kid's ability or even an inkling to offer, new ideas. And so I worry when a Chinese child, the average Chinese child, goes from a teacher knows best classroom to a parent knows best environment at home, and they're not really getting that opportunity to express or even make their own decisions, especially when it comes to school.
Yeah, I mean, what seems so challenging to me, and this is one of the things that really struck me in reading the book, is that, I mean, having 4 kids myself, I can't imagine fostering that level of hard work without such an authoritarian system. And so, like, it just seems, it seems so challenging to think about, like, how would you at the same time, like, I guess I wonder if you came to think that you can have both. Like, can you have the level of work that it would take to achieve this level of rigor academically while also fostering student agency? Like, we think in our work that we need both. We need academic rigor and we need to foster a sense of agency, and we're just sort of thinking we can pursue both. But in reading the book, I was just thinking, I can't imagine getting this level of hard work and rigor while also getting the kind of creativity and individuality.
It's funny, the Chinese, I kept looking at this issue, and I was talking to some of the teachers as these relationships developed. I began to find teachers who are very open to talking to me about some of these issues. And they say, Lenora, you have it wrong. It's not about what we term in the West helicopter parenting. It's more about instilling the right discipline at an early age and sort of the habits around study. And then you let the kid go. They sort of believe that it's easier to start strict in some ways and then let up. And really by the end of primary school, the expectation is that the child is doing his own homework. He's been enabled and he believes that he can do it. And it's all that early signaling, and it is a lot of work in the beginning. And in some ways it's a little bit counter to some trends in American parenting and education. But it's just an interesting dichotomy to think about, I think.
I would say it's exactly opposite to the American trends, at least many of them. I mean, and did you come away thinking that this is maybe something we should all consider? Like, maybe we should really think about, like, a slightly different system where we start with that level of rigor in primary and then free things up.
I think what's so wonderful about what we have in the US is there are choices. There's so many different styles of education and parenting. And I came through this journey really understanding that, embracing this constant debate, what are the weaknesses in the schooling and home environment, really taken as a sum, right? And where are the strengths and weaknesses and where do we patch? And when I've been traveling, talking about this book, I'm finding that parents are really doing this. If they have their kid in a very play-based, child-centered academic environment where there's not a lot of content delivery, they're sort of whispering, well, we're supplementing with Kumon on the side, our math worksheets. And I think it's a very useful debate to have.
Yeah. To go back to something else you said, that there's a movement among some in the education community, as towards kind of personalization, like meeting students' individual needs, fostering their individual interests, letting them go at their own pace. And I finished your book wondering whether that would work in China, like whether it would be culturally appropriate. Like, it seems that so much about the system is kind of oriented towards socializing kids and developing them into kind of a collective culture. And yet, as you mentioned a minute ago, like there are these reforms underway, but I just wonder how you think about this and whether you could see personalization and even technology enabled personalization like actually gaining traction in China, or whether you think that ultimately it may not like resonate with the culture.
I think it's going to take a long time, but I think that the younger teachers that I've met, especially the ones who've spent a good amount of time overseas, I don't want to say learn very quickly, but their eyes are being opened to another way to talk to children. Even the way that they structure the classroom, for example, in early childhood. One teacher said, "Oh, in the US, kids can sit in a circle and they get up, whenever they want and explore the classroom." And this was just mind-boggling to her. But then she's tried it in her classroom. So some of the top training institutions in Shanghai, at least, encourage teachers to spend a year abroad. And I feel that they're really open to learning and bringing some of these methods back home. And actually, if you look at the latest National Education Reform Plan, it includes words like creating an environment for individual expression. At the early level, ages 3 to 6, they develop those guidelines in conjunction with UNICEF. Every child will progress at different rates, respecting individual differences. The problem is when you actually put this into practice in the classroom, it doesn't always come through because of that sort of, top-down sort of teacher culture. And I think it will take a generation or two, if not longer, to sort of really transform. Now, in the rural, in the countryside, these teachers aren't really getting as much access to training and some of these new ideas that they are in the cities. So
yeah,
it really depends.
And do you think that the move towards a more individualized system is inherently a good thing? I mean, I think many of us might assume, yes, of course it is. But when I think about the strengths of China and the culture, like, is it necessarily true that this would be a good thing, or will people like go down this path and then realize, whoa, what have we done?
What's interesting? It's the parents that revolt. When I talk to principals who are trying some of these reforms, it's the parents that say, well, I need my kid to sit and study because he needs to pass the entrance exam. I talked to one Shanghai primary school who tried to institute play, another one who tried to let high school kids out an hour early every Monday so they could explore the city. And the parents were saying, wait a second, I need my kid studying. What are you doing? And it's really the constraints of parental expectation, as well as that exam-based system, that's going to keep any reform from really happening on a large scale until they fix that. So, but, I think it would be great if Chinese students in general felt more empowered. I absolutely do.
So one of the things, and we were talking at the very front end about this, but that was so striking from your book, is just how incredibly high the expectations for kids are compared to what exists in many parts of the world, especially in math. I don't know if you can bring that to life a bit. Actually, can you do that for this?
Sure. So, in my book, I follow 2 Shanghai high school students. I find my son interesting and the early education because it's around habit formation. But eventually I broaden out to rural areas, and I also follow 2 high school students that I've known for 5 or 6 years now. And the boy, his name is Darcy, he says, it's very important for your son to memorize Cheng Fa Biao. And pretty much every Chinese school child, at least in urban areas, by 2nd grade can, write out the multiplication tables. It's just, it's muscle memory, right? 20 seconds. And in math, China's curriculum is really quite rigorous. And, it's important. When I talk to the American education professors who come over to China to look at this issue, they say that they're frustrated by sort of Western attitudes towards math. It's sort of mathematics literacy. We don't necessarily need it, but you would never hear a parent say, oh, it doesn't matter if my kid doesn't learn how to read. Reading is important, but the culture less emphasizes math. I found studies that showed in China, in early childhood or even at home, there's a term called family education, and parents are working on math and reading at home, whereas in the West, we're working only on reading before school readiness. So I think it's just kind of an interesting difference to think about.
Yeah. And Do you have thoughts about how to influence the expectations everywhere? I mean, what would that take?
I think there needs to be acculturation to this idea that it's actually important. And in the book, I cite studies that show one London-based think tank. It was a very tens of thousands of preschoolers, and then they trailed them over a number of decades and found that primary math skills actually correlated with earnings much later in life. And there are a number of studies that show that math is incredibly important. So I think it's sort of hitting that home that we do need to get our kids mathematics literacy. But also this belief that they can learn. And I really worry about the minority kids and the disadvantaged kids. There was a study that came out a couple of weeks ago or earlier in the year that the language around these children in the classroom is a little bit different because of this belief in whatever it is, this importance of innate ability. And we're giving up on kids before they're reaching their potential.
I was also really interested in the research that you cited in the book about the importance of memorization. You know, I think we spend so much, I hear a lot, you know, just the pushback against rote memorization. And yet it seems that there's real value to kids in needing to memorize. And I wonder if you can say a bit about what that research shows.
So I gave a talk at UC Irvine yesterday, and there was a psychology professor in the audience, and he's been working on issues of cognitive memory for a really long time. And he actually says the act of memorization helps activate the working memory. It's a muscle, and that knowledge in the storehouse of the brain helps enable learning and even the creative process. And there's sort of a growing philosophy in the West that you can just sort of Google something that you need to know. You don't need to sort of lock it away. The cognitive science shows that's not true. And to me as a parent, you know, I began to get worried. My son would come home with math facts. Chinese children are also required to memorize poetry, historical facts, but they believe the memory is primed for expansion in the early years. And there's some things that do need to be committed. Obviously, you know, when it comes to rote learning and when you're just teaching to a test and memorizing for a test, that's not what I'm talking about.
Right. Yeah. So you all, I'm about to open this up for your questions, so be thinking. But just one more. You, as you noted, showed us kind of through the book other parts of the system and kind of brought to life the daunting nature of the challenge, you know, given the Chinese government's commitment to educational excellence and equity. And I wonder if you can share a bit about the nature of that challenge as they think about how do we get to the point where all kids have an excellent education.
Yeah, you know, and you know this more than anyone. You've been working in these areas for so long. I felt it important to include the story of families in rural China. And so I do follow a migrant worker who's lived apart from her son since he was a baby. He suddenly turns 15, 16 years old and is facing that high school entrance exam. And she realized he's about to fall off that educational ladder. And it is devastating for families who cannot stay on. And the jobs that were awaiting in the book, his name is Dream. The jobs that awaited his parents, who also fell off the educational ladder, are not necessarily going to be there for him. And that's really what I worry about the most. And China is really working on issues of equality, at least in the policy manuals that I read. They are implementing all kinds of things. They're trying to incent teachers to go out to rural areas by fast-tracking them for promotions and pay. But I think there's a lot of other structural issues that need to be addressed, such as the household registration system. You know, it's harder for kids in rural Hunan to get into good colleges versus kids in Beijing because of this internal passport system and the differences in content between entrance exams. And there's so many issues that they need to fix, least of all funding. So.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so let me open this up to you guys. Feel free to let me know via chat if you have a question, and I'll call on you to ask it. You don't need to let me know what it is.
But you know, the national education budget has increased 15 to 20% year over year over the last decade, which is astounding if you think about it. And they're starting at a much lower level than in the US, but they are trying. Many people say it's still not enough.
Wow, that's
but the
amazing.
intention is there at least.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. What questions do you guys have? I'm really hung up, I mean, while folks give this thought on the cultural, like it seems like there's such a strength in a collective culture, and irrespective, it's kind of based in the values of a certain society, you know, and I keep wondering whether there isn't something fundamentally, like a more personalized system could really come up against the cultural value around collectivism. And I just wonder a bit about how that plays over time. I mean, you were saying you think it would definitely be good to better meet the individual needs of kids. I mean, my own instincts, that sounds right, but I'm a product of a more individualized, you know, culture. And I just wonder about the cultural impacts of that.
You know, it's interesting. They are trying to do more for kids with, you know, special needs and learning disabilities, but they're not really looking at mainstreaming. You know, the policies say that, you know, cities of over 300,000 should have a school to sort of capture these kids, because right now they're falling out of the system. This is one of the things that they just have not paid any attention to at all. But they're approaching it in a very different way that we are here in the US. I do think they believe that the classroom moves forward at a faster pace if everyone's sort of at the same level. You know, it's a very different approach to education.
Yeah. Okay, let me just ask you, Shaquille, to go ahead and articulate your question if you can. I see that you wrote it out, but can you introduce yourself and ask the question?
Sure. Hi, I'm Shaquille Ahmed from Teach for Bangladesh. And
Hi.
yeah, it's nice seeing. I was kind of hearing about you, how like parents are involved whenever they're trying to do something new about play or letting them an hour earlier. And in the same way, we also understand that like everyone's kind of like dependent on exam-based systems or systems which assessment system which sort of like encourage memorization. And I was just wondering, like, are there stories in Shanghai where people are trying to communicate to parents about education and seeing whether that advocacy is making any difference? And also at the same time, any experiments or thoughts on like whether how the exam system can be changed?
So I'll tackle that second one first. Shanghai is a pilot area for reform. And certain schools are also designated for being able to do certain things with the curriculum that others can't. And they understand, for decades, they've tried to lessen the importance of entrance exams. For example, in Shanghai, when you select for college, it used to be that single entrance exam score. Now they're trying things like, let's look at volunteering, let's look at interviews, let's look at kids' other competencies outside of just academics. And they're even trying, you know, let's look at high school test scores rather than that just one entrance exam score. And the idea is to lessen the study pressure. But what they've found is that introduces human decision, human error and judgment. So when you swing too far in that direction in a society where, you know, influence can be traded, then you move too much into the gray zone. So it's always going to be constrained by this, you know, test score versus other factors and where do you fall on that spectrum. And there's a lot of turmoil around this, and it's not evenly distributed. You know, kids in Shanghai benefit from reforms, but not kids in rural Anhui or Guizhou, and that is contributing to inequality. So it really is a messy path forward, and it's a combination of sort of top-down policies that don't seem to be taking effect, and also just parents and educators in certain schools trying things in their own environment. So it is messy. As far as parents, the ones in Shanghai, at least, they're fairly well-traveled. They go abroad on vacation. They're educated, and they're thinking about a lot of the same things that we are. I don't see much difference between me and the average Shanghai parent. So in having these conversations with people like me and with you and educators abroad, they are learning from each other.
One of the things that you said that's so striking and that came through in the book as well is just how deeply ingrained the growth mindset is versus the kind of innate ability paradigm. And it's fascinating. There's just a new study out, I don't know if you saw it, that McKinsey did, that showed that literally a kid's mindset as it relates to growth, the growth versus innate ability mindset, is more powerful as a predictor of achievement than socioeconomic background. I mean, this is revolutionary. It's also very reinforcing of what we found through our own work over time. But I wonder where you think, I mean, it's a big lift to shift that mindset, and it's so fascinating that you find that this is kind of pervasive, at least in Shanghai. I don't know if you would say across China, but I wonder what the roots of that are, and if you have any thoughts on how to affect a huge cultural shift across the world.
I think it's very different. I think a lot of that effort, belief in effort, comes from all the way back to the imperial exam system, because, the governing, whoever is governing China, whether it was an emperor or now it's the party, they really need their population to believe that it's a meritocracy, that you can advance anyone, whether you're a peasant family from the countryside or, more privileged in the cities, especially in this society where it's so differentiated, everyone has a chance at success. And I think it partly comes from that exam system. It partly comes from the culture as well. And so it's a whole mix of things. How do we shift that thinking in the West? Wow, that's really difficult. I mean, the studies have shown that the Asian cultures are more likely to believe that when it comes to achievement. And I think it starts with conversations, and maybe some re-education, maybe some training. I really think this family culture, I think that is what the Chinese bring to the table that we could really think about. The entire family taking responsibility for their kids' progress. I talk to American teachers here, and they feel that much more is being punted back onto their shoulders now than a generation ago, or more is expected of the school. And what if we took more of that on ourselves at home? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and we're all very busy working parents, but I think it's really that mind shift.
Interesting.
The belief that our kids can do it, and also that we should be helping them achieve.
I wonder how much of the kind of racial and ethnic differences in achievement would actually come down to this growth mindset difference. Actually, we should look at that. That would be so fascinating.
That's a great question. I know. I'm thinking about the schools that you're working in, and whether this would work. It would take some resources to get in there and work individually with families, I imagine.
It's families, but it's also teachers. We've seen that the most effective teachers are deeply propagating a growth mindset. I mean, and it's definitely, I think it's coming much more into the system, but as you say, we need to influence the parents as well. Diane, you have a question? Yes. Hold on, hold on.
Hi, Lenora.
Hi.
My name's Diane Robinson, and I'm the Global Projects Lead for Teach for All.
Hi.
And,
Hi, Diane.
Fascinating to listen to you. I actually got a chance to visit Shanghai right after the 2009 PISA results came out. So it's bringing me back. And I have a question. It's really about teacher consistency. One of the things that struck me when I was visiting schools there was the way, two things, the caliber of the teachers, and also the consistency in terms of planning and collaborating. And I noticed in this one school I visited, they didn't have desks in classrooms. They had a separate room where everyone had a desk, and they would plan together and collaborate. And I think part of the challenge that we have is lack of consistency across classrooms, right? In schools, especially in low-income communities, where you'll have a high-quality teacher and next door you don't have another. And I guess I'm just curious to hear your perspective, both on sort of the overall who teaches in the Shanghai system, like where do they get the talent? And then also, what is different about the way that they train and support their teachers, especially when you get at this issue of consistency again across schools and classrooms because I think that has so much to do with why they're able to do this at a system level, if that makes sense.
That's a great question.
Multi-pronged question.
So in the latter chapters of my book, I do talk about teacher training. Teachers in Shanghai are pretty world class. There's some wonderful training institutions, and a lot of those pour right into some of the Shanghai schools. There is a tradition of observing teaching methods, observing other teachers' classrooms, either by subject or school-wide, and also visiting other schools. And they actually build this time into the workday. And that is, I think, one of the biggest differences. When I talk to American teachers, they feel that there isn't a lot of time for this, and if they want to do training or professional development, it's largely extracurricular. But in China, they think it's very important. For example, some schools, including my son's last year, let out school an hour early, and it was partly a reform. First, they wanted kids to have more time to play and do athletics. But secondly, they wanted to give that hour back to the teacher for training and prep. And so you build it into the workday for Chinese teachers, and you also have this rich culture of collaboration and learning from each other and swapping notes. And even the most senior teachers are observing younger teachers and giving feedback. And it goes both ways. And not only within subjects, like a math teacher observing a math teacher, but across disciplines, math observing history or English. So that is, to me, is very, very interesting, and something that we could possibly learn. And this, all the way down through a teacher's career into the 30th year. What was the other part of the question? Where do they get?
I think it was the scale issue about, and I think for me, I was just wondering, how do they do it? It's a 13 million.
Yeah, so they are having trouble, honestly, keeping teachers coming into the pipeline just as we are, because pay has not kept up with the pace of the economy. And it used to be that teachers were incredibly well paid. It was considered sort of the iron rice bowl, what they call in China. It's state-supported pension and benefits, but pay has not kept up, because the salaries of professionals have sort of leapfrogged ahead, and they're working on that. And that is part of the national education budget. They understand this is part of keeping respect for teachers high. That's actually part of the National Education Reform Plan, increasing the social status of teachers. And it's already the tops in the world. In the book, I cite a study, half of all Chinese would encourage their kids to become teachers, whereas in the US or in Great Britain, it's less than a third. So it's all linked. You pay your teachers more people want to come to the profession. It's the signaling around respect for teachers that helps. And China really understands that. The ministry understands that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me ask Aliyah, also from Teach for Bangladesh, to ask her question.
Hi, thank you for having this call. I'm learning a lot, so I'm very excited. I think my question comes from a little bit of context of why I'm just asking this question, is that our classrooms and our schools do not have enough support. Like, we have very high number of students in the classroom, 50 to 60, sometimes 80 and 100 in one classroom. And also the teacher number is really low because there's not sufficient teachers there. And I was thinking, like, in such a situation where there is not enough support and not enough resources in terms of Bangladesh context, how do we, what are the key things that we focus to build growth mindset and so that we can try out different methods of quality education practices so that we are more innovative and more creative as well? And what are the key areas for that we focus on?
That's a great question. In China, they had this problem, especially in the countryside. I had actually an education professor tell me, because of the large classroom sizes, a generation ago, there was no other way to be but authoritarian and very teacher-centered. There just wasn't the resources or the manpower to really deliver any other kind of education. They're working on decreasing class sizes, very interestingly enough. And I wouldn't know how, that's a really challenging question. That's not really something I've studied. But I think it's difficult with such a large class size.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, in China, in the better resource schools, they are, there's a master teacher and an associate teacher, and usually even sort of a classroom helper. So the more adults you can get into the classroom, I think the better. But, that would be a challenge, I would imagine, for Bangladesh.
I assume that Aaliyah, you and others have seen the book Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck. I think that's what it's called, which is,
Yes.
is an incredible resource on this question, I think.
Yeah, I think it's making sure that teachers understand the language about how you talk to children, about, effort in the classroom. It's funny, someone who read my book wrote in and said, I think that he was an educator, I think we should ban the use of the word talent in our classrooms in the US, because he felt he was always told, I'm so smart, and he just thought that things should come to him naturally, but that's not true. You actually need to work at it. And so maybe the first thing is to talk to the teachers about how they talk around effort and achievement.
In a personal note, my son, my second son, read the book Growth Mindset this summer, and he swears that it has changed his life, and every day is different. And he just, everywhere he goes, he's like, you got to read this book, you got to read this book, because it just was so different from everything he felt, even though we are sitting here thinking that we're propagating a growth mindset. He's like, no, this is exactly different from everything I've experienced in school, which is so fascinating. So maybe we just need to take it to the kids themselves.
And also, I've also had people write in and say, there's that one teacher who sat me down, and instead of saying, oh, that's great, I'm glad you tried, it was more, you're not working hard enough, you have more potential than this, and you're not achieving it. And, and a few people did write in and say that is really what made the difference for them. And I think that we're afraid to say that to our kids. Maybe the parents will get mad. If you're a teacher and you say that to a child, the parent would get upset, or, so it's empowering the teacher too.
It's funny because we're not afraid to say it on the football field.
Right.
Like, it's just incredible to see the difference in athletics versus school, and just so fascinating.
Can I just read a brief passage from a professor? His name is Jim Stigler, and he's been going back and forth to the US and China for decades. But he says, Americans are on the right track when it comes to athletics. It's about getting better, working harder. In sports, we're okay with competition and struggle. And the American conscience is also okay with rankings in sports, because a 9th place finish simply indicates a runner should retool and continue training. A 9th place finish does not reflect poorly on a person's self-esteem or worth. And if we could just transfer some of that thinking into the classroom, I do feel we'd be better off.
Great. Well, this is such a good discussion. Any other questions, you guys? Lenora, thank you so much for joining us. This was terrific. And everyone, what can you tell us the full title of the book? Little Soldiers.
An American Boy, a Chinese School, and the Global Race to Achieve. And I should note that it's really not just about my son. I talked to a number of international education experts. I talked to people who go back and forth, go to global education conferences. And I really wanted to bring to the forefront some of the issues that other countries are looking at when it comes to education.
Yeah, no, and I think you do it really well, and would encourage everyone to give it a read. I think it has real implications for our work here across Teach for All. So thank you, Lenora, for a beautiful book and for joining us this morning very early your time.
Thanks for this opportunity.
Thanks.